Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William Taft, and the focus is rock bottom. The year is 1910. It's late in the year. Nothing's going right in the Taft administration. Theodore Roosevelt is now breaking with Taft. His progressive followers had not liked Taft really throughout his entire term in office. And he just had a shellacking in the midterm elections where the Republicans lost control of the House to the Democrats, and they lost a big piece of their majority in the Senate. This was not going to be a good sign for the second half of his term. But he still had some governing to do. He had some things that were important to him, including a trade deal, a free trade deal with Canada. He thought this was finally an opportunity to make this pact come together. He negotiated the agreement with the Liberal government in Canada, but by the time he got to the Senate, this was going to be a tough sell. Trade deals are always difficult, and sure enough, in this lame duck Congress, he was unable to get this through, but he wasn't giving up. He decided a risky move to call a special session of Congress to start right away as soon as this Congress ended. Now, this was risky because the Democrats now had a lot more control, and he was advised, don't do this. But he said, I do not care a tinker's damn whether it injures my political prospects or not. It's one of the most important pieces of legislation that has been under consideration in a decade. The opportunity to make this favorable trade agreement will have passed probably forever if we do not strike it this time. So he decided to personally lobby a whole bunch of senators. He took them golfing, which he rarely did, and he actually got it through, mostly with Democrat support. Some of the progressive Republicans, the old guard Republican Party, was against this, so he very much crossed party lines. He got an agreement, and then it all fell apart. The Speaker of the House, Champ Clark, made a statement to the effect that this was just the beginning in the relationship with Canada. In fact, this was such a positive move that really annexation was hinted at is what the Americans really wanted. Well, this did not go over well in Canada. In fact, the Liberal government fell over this. A new government was elected, and they killed the deal. So after all of this effort, William Taft's effort to have a reciprocity agreement with Canada was dead. In fact, he was right. It was going to take a long time, some 80 years before the United States and Canada would actually have a free trade agreement at this level. So another disappointment for Taft. There was another area, again, very important to Taft. Arbitration, international agreements. Now, this was an unstable time in world history. This is 1910, 11, 12. Countries were saber-rattling, and Taft was among those who was very concerned that battlefield compact was really on the horizon. And he believed, he was a judge, that third-party judicial personnel could actually arbitrate a lot of these most serious disputes. And so he gave a speech to the American Arbitration and Peace League, which he said, if we do not have arbitration, we shall have war. It was as simple as that. Well, the British and the French were in the audience at this speech, and they were interested. They were intrigued. And so the United States entered into an agreement with actually both Britain and France. They negotiated it to have arbitration for pretty much any disputes between the three countries. What happened next? United States Senate once again got in the way of this agreement because there were many in the Senate who thought this was a mistake. They were kind of outsourcing American sovereignty to a third party, and this was anathema to them. In areas of the vital interest of the United States, which they went on to define, they came up with amendment at amendment of things that would not go to arbitration, that would be exceptions to this agreement. By the time it finally came to Taft, he said, look, I don't even recognize this agreement that we had. I'm not going to submit it to the British or the French. Another major disappointment, a kind of a dead end in an area that Taft would bring up again in his post-presidency. But for now, this idea of arbitration had come to an end. Well, and also coming to an end in many ways was Taft's presidency, as his break with Theodore Roosevelt was about to be complete, and that would have dramatic implications for these last couple of years in office. And ironically, it was an area where the progressive followers of Roosevelt actually liked a lot of what the Taft administration was doing. Trust busting. Now, Roosevelt, known as the trust buster, had used the Sherman Antitrust Act more than 40 times to bring lawsuits against these large combinations of businesses, and the progressives loved this. Well, Taft went much further. In only one term in office, he raised almost 90 cases in the Sherman Antitrust Act, including he also completed deals that Roosevelt's administration had started to break up Standard Oil and break up American Tobacco. These were big deals, and again, the progressives were in support, except one deal. One case got Theodore Roosevelt really upset. This goes back to Roosevelt's term as president. In 1907, there was an economic panic. Businesses were closing. Businesses were threatening to close. And one of them was a large steel producer that was in Tennessee, Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. They were about to go under. U.S. Steel, which had the majority of the market run by J.P. Morgan, said, look, we'll come in, we'll rescue that company, we'll bring them into our fold, but I don't want to do it if you're going to come after me for antitrust, because they would now have about 62% of the steel market. So Morgan went to the White House, met with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, look, this is a good thing for the economy. I'm not going to do anything in this case. They made the purchase. 4 years later, Taft's Attorney General, George Wickersham, filed suit against U.S. Steel. This is late in the year, and this was again over that purchase of Tennessee Coal and Iron. And Roosevelt is livid. He thought this was a complete betrayal by William Taft. According to Roosevelt, Taft was a member of my cabinet when I took that action. We went over it in full and in detail, not only at one, but at 2 or 3 meetings. He was enthusiastic in his praise of what was done. It ill becomes him either by himself or through another afterwards to act as he is now acting. Roosevelt took this personally. He thought he was being made a fool of by the Taft administration. Roosevelt's sister, Corinne Robinson, made the comment, if it had not been for that steel suit. I was talking with Theodore only last week, and he said that he could never forgive. Well, Roosevelt had already been being pushed by his progressive followers to run in the 1912 election, to take on Taft and reassert himself into the national leadership. He had been balking. Look, he still tried to give Taft the benefit of the doubt, but this was, it seemed like the last straw, because within a couple of weeks after this, he's really starting to hint that he would accept the nomination. And by the time it's early February of 1912, he said quite out that my hat is in the ring, the fight is on, and I am stripped to the buff. Just a couple of weeks later, he added, I will accept the nomination for president if it is tendered to me, and the race was now on, Roosevelt against Taft for the Republican nomination. Now, what about Roosevelt's pledge not to run again? You recall back in 1904, the night that he was elected for his full term, he said, I'm not going to accept another nomination for presidency. Well, he explained in his memoirs what he meant was consecutive nominations. This third nomination, although technically his second, but he had filled out McKinley's term for most of that term. So this was not consecutive. It's okay. That's not exactly what he said in 04, but again, at this point, didn't matter. He was full speed ahead. Now, this was the worst nightmare for William Taft, personally, politically, and the worst nightmare for the Republican Party, because this was just going to break the party apart. Roosevelt went on the stump. He was vicious in his attacks, and at one point, he crossed a line as far as Taft was concerned. And it wasn't a personal attack that got Taft. It was an ideological comment that he made about something that the progressives had been pushing called judicial recall. Judicial recall, in a couple of different flavors, meant that the public could actually outvote judges, either on a particular decision or actually to recall a judge, who, even a federal judge who had a lifetime appointment, and take them away from that based on the will of the people. And this is part of the Republican, or this is part of the progressive mantra that they were pushing. Well, this was complete anathema to William Taft. He was a judge at heart. He thought the independence of the judiciary was absolutely crucial for them being able to be successful. And he said at the time that one who so lightly regards constitutional principles, speaking of Roosevelt, and especially the independence of the judiciary, and who's so naturally impatient of legal restraints and of due legal procedure, and who has so misunderstood what liberty regulated by law is, could not safely be entrusted with successive presidential terms. I say this sorrowfully, but I say it with the full conviction of truth. For the first time, William Taft was actually starting to think, maybe I need to fight for my job. Well, he's going to have to do this next piece of fighting without his trusted military aide, Archibald Butt. Butt, as you recall, is close to Roosevelt and close to Taft. As they are going their separate ways, this is very difficult for him. He's working way too hard, and Taft agrees he needs a break. So Butt decides, okay, I'll take that break. I'm going to go off to Europe for a couple of months, spends about a month in Italy, and he starts getting a bit anxious. He wants to get back. The convention is coming up for the Republicans pretty soon. So he decides to buy a ticket for the maiden voyage of a new ocean liner by the name of the RMS Titanic. The Titanic sets sail on April the 10th of 1912. It strikes an iceberg just before midnight on April the 14th. There were only 20 lifeboats aboard, and Archie Butt was one of the 1,503 people who perished. And William Taft, President of the United States, took this really, really hard. He was like a member of my family, Taft said of Butt, and I feel his loss. If it had been a younger brother, I cannot refrain from saying that I miss him every minute. And this would drag on Taft personally. He's got the rift with Roosevelt. Now he's lost Archie Butt, but the political cycle wasn't going to stop. The party was divided coming up on the Republican convention, and this was going to be an absolute mess. There were 250 seats that were disputed as to who the right delegates were. This is more than in any convention in American history. And why was this the case? Well, in this election, many of the Republican states had adopted primary elections where the people would have a say who their delegates would be to the national convention. Not all the states, still pretty new, but Roosevelt basically ran the table. He was extremely popular in like 9 of these in a row, and a lot of these delegates then showed up for the convention. So the convention hasn't even started yet, and the Credentials Committee has a big task ahead to figure out who to seat, because some of these states were sending a number of disputed delegates, one for Taft, one for Roosevelt, who would get the seat. Well, it turns out that the old guard Republicans were the ones running this convention. They were still supportive of Taft, so it wasn't going to be a big surprise when they started ruling in his favor on these disputed delegates. Of the 102 delegates they adjudicated first, 101 went to Taft. 1 went to Roosevelt, and he smelled a rat. He left New York, got on a train, went to Chicago, got to his hotel room, opened the window, and to cheering crowds, he said, "It is a fight against theft, and the thieves will not win." He was fired up and ready to fight for this nomination. But there wasn't much he could do about it. By all things done by the Credentials Committee, the end tally, Taft, 235 of those delegates would be seated for him, 19 for Roosevelt. The election was essentially over and the convention hadn't even started yet. But Roosevelt was not going to go away quietly, as he rarely would. He refused to accept this result, and he had Henry Allen of Kansas read a statement, a lengthy statement, to the convention that included, "The convention is now composed, has no claim to represent the voters of the Republican Party. It represents nothing but successful fraud and overriding the will of the rank and file of the party." And what did Roosevelt say? He said to his supporters, "Don't vote. A protest. We're not going to be a party to this." Well, in the end, enough voted for Taft. He got 561 votes, 187 for Roosevelt. Taft got the nomination, but this hardly settled the matter because the Roosevelts and the progressives, they were still very animated, and that very night they met across town in Chicago and said, "We do not accept this result. Roosevelt is our man. We're going to break away and start our own party." And the Progressive Party was born. They had their own convention a couple of months later, and Roosevelt was formally nominated. The happiest person of all was the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson. He had barely beaten out Speaker of the House Champ Clark for the Democratic nomination, took 48 ballots to get him there, but once he had it, now Roosevelt's breaking the Republican Party, Wilson had to say, "Good old Teddy," what a help he is, because he basically handed Wilson the election. Now, what about Taft? What did he do while all this was going on? He mostly hung out in Washington, kind of stayed quiet, mostly he was depressed, played a lot of golf, but he wasn't backing down. If anything, he was motivated to keep Roosevelt out of the White House. He saw him as dangerous. "Whether I win or lose is not important," Taft said. "I am in this fight to perform a public duty, the duty of keeping Theodore Roosevelt out of the White House. I believe I represent a safer and saner view of our government and its Constitution." So he would get out. He would campaign. He wasn't very good at it. Roosevelt, of course, was a much better campaigner. Roosevelt had an interesting strategy. He wasn't actually going to go after Taft. He was going to focus on Wilson. What did he do with Taft? He basically ignored him. At one of his rallies, somebody yelled out, "Tell us about Taft." And Roosevelt responded, "I never discuss dead issues." This hurt Taft even more. He wasn't even being attacked. He was being ignored. This did not set well, but again, he was still going to try to fight to keep Roosevelt out. Didn't matter that he was depressed. Didn't matter that he was upset about this. He was still going to fight, but it was affecting him. He told a colleague during the campaign, "No one knows how deeply Roosevelt, has wounded me. I shall always be gratified for what he did for me, but since he has come back, he has seared me to the very soul." This was the lowest of the low in terms of the times for William Taft. The results of the election, completely predictable. The impact of Roosevelt's entry into the race basically ruined any chances for the Republicans to win, ruined Taft's political career, handed the power to his political enemies, but he was on a righteous mission, and even if all this destruction was in its wake, that's what Roosevelt was going to do, and that's what eventually happened. Wilson won only 42% of the popular vote, but he had a huge majority in the Electoral College with 435 votes. Roosevelt was second with 88. William Taft, the incumbent president, won just 2 states and 8 electoral votes. Now, a number of incumbents over American history had not been renominated by their parties, but anyone who had been renominated, this was the worst showing of an incumbent running again in American history, winning only those 2 states. Again, what could have been? If you look at the popular vote, Roosevelt and Taft combined for almost 51% of the popular vote. If the Republicans had unified around a single candidate, whether it's Roosevelt, Taft, or even somebody else, there's a good chance that the Republicans would have kept the White House. But by breaking the party, as Roosevelt did when he got in and refused to accept the results of the Republican convention, that handed power to their political enemies. So, end of the term for William Taft is ahead, actually quite a bit of relief. He was probably his most relaxed as he was walking out the door. Transfer of power with Woodrow Wilson on March 4th of 1913. He could finally relax a little bit, look ahead to maybe better years ahead after a really last couple of years of very tough times. That's William Taft and Rock Bottom from the life of William Taft. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.